Morning, everyone. Welcome to Power Over Data and Algorithms, Can We Get It Back? And more particularly, it's a session to discuss Ada Lovelace Institute's Rethinking Data project. And I'm really proud to have been part of the working group for that project and that report, which is made up of some of the leading lights in data protection, including my fellow panelists, Michael, Reagan, Kasia, and Paul. There are two features flowing from the title of that project, Rethinking Data. Firstly, it's this attempt to rethink, re-engage, and evolve existing approaches. And it really gives us some time as an organisation and as a panel to think and reflect on what we have at the moment and what it is we need to rethink. And what are we rethinking approaches to? The title is data, but why is data the focus? What role does data play in our digital era? Is data the cause of power, and is the opportunity to rebalance individual standing done through changes to data? The project therefore has quite an ambitious vision for data that works for people and society. And it's a really important piece of work addressing some of the main challenges being discussed at CPDP. And at its core, the issues in the report and in the project are about power dynamics. For example, the GDPR is not strictly a privacy regime, it's a charter of rights to allow people to have some control over how their data and information is used. And control over that data has given private corporate actors a lot of power. Personal data has given large platforms the capacity to monetize their offering through segmenting society and behavioral analytics for advertising purposes. Likewise, lesser-known companies are able to use data to target vulnerable individuals, for example, in the gambling context, the online gambling context. Conversely, providing individuals with power over how their information is used goes some way to redressing that power imbalance. Basic rights such as the right to access, object, rectification, etc. have gone some way to addressing the imbalance. And we're here to discuss Ada Lovelace Institute's report on how to rethink data and offer some ambitious views on change. The excellent panelists will discuss some of the preliminary findings, offer provocations, and engage the audience in this thinking. And we're really keen to have quite a dynamic conversation today, both amongst the panel and with you, so we'll try and leave a lot of time at the end for questions. And there's quite a lot to get through. It's quite a big topic. So I'm firstly going to hand over to Valentina Pavel from Ada Lovelace Institute to explore the report in a lot more detail. Thanks, Valentina.
Thank you, Ravi, and it's such a nice feeling to be here in person again and to see so many familiar faces. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you to our panelists for accepting our invitation. It's really great to have you. My name is Valentina Pavel, and I'm a legal researcher at the Ada Lovelace Institute. We are an independent research institute, and our mission is to ensure that data and AI work for people and society. And for us, that means that the opportunities and benefits that are generated by data and AI are justly and equitably distributed and experienced. And we put our mission into practice by convening different voices, by building research, and by shaping good policy and practice. Our main home is in the UK, but we recently opened a base in the EU with the aim to provide evidence-based research to inform policy, to do analysis, and to convene and engage on the AI Act. If we can go to the next slide. I can go to the next slide because I have a clicker here. Yeah, sorry about this. I joined the Ada Lovelace Institute 2 years ago to work on a big question. What would a more ambitious vision for data look like? And by no means this was an easy task. We established an international working group. Many of the working group members are here, either on the panel or in the room somewhere. We asked the working group to guide our thinking towards articulating a more positive ambition for data that centers governance, regulation, and use towards people and society, and really responds to the needs of people instead of corporate agendas. And we also invited them to identify together what would be the most promising interventions in order to be able to transform the digital landscape. And we immediately saw that today's digital system is basically running on data harvesting and exploitation. We see an increasing loss of agency and autonomy over data. And we see that there's a concentration of the benefits that come from data and AI in the hands of a few large companies. And we need a more radical and more transformative vision for that. And as Achim Klabunde reminded us in the opening panel, data protection is meant to address asymmetries of power and to restrain some of the power grab over data. But the GDPR, it's not enough in itself. And although we can say we can congratulate it on its first birthday today, we still see that it's still a very young piece of legislation. Still, we haven't reached its full potential. So we're quite, although many people in the room are experts in the field, I think we can all agree that we still have a long way to go in order to realize its full potential. And we have heard throughout the conference that we need to do more than that. We need to correct business models. We need to reduce dependencies. We need to identify a more efficient system of enforcement. And we also need to think about the collective dimension. So our report is going to be published in the upcoming months and provides a map of the areas for change that we think need urgent attention. And our focus is on 4 promising interventions which have been selected because of their potential to shift power dynamics and to rebalance the digital ecosystem. We understood that we need new types of infrastructure in order to open up ecosystems for choice and competition. We need new governance models to reclaim control over data and algorithms. We need new institutions that can rebalance power over data. And we need to ensure a more inclusive public participation in decisions over data and in tech policy making. So with the help of our brilliant panel speakers, today's discussion is going to focus on providing more insight into these 4 cross-cutting interventions for change, their potential and also their challenges. And try to, together with you, engage in a dynamic discussion to flesh out these ideas and to find solutions together. And I hope you will accept our provocation today to join this collective effort and try to find solutions to move towards more transformative and more people-focused vision for data. So thank you very much, and I'll leave our panelists to offer you more insight and more provocations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Valentina. Thank you for that overview of the report. And as you can see from what we've just discussed, there's a lot to explore and there's a lot within the report. So to get our panelists thinking and to get you all thinking, I'd like to start by asking you to give us your reflections on where we are now and whether there is a power problem. Can I start with you, Reagan?
Sure. Can you all hear me?
I
have to lean in. That's the theme of the conference.
There we go.
Okay, so is there a power problem? I would say yes, and actually the answer is in the question. I think that's one of the core issues, is that the power resides, the power doesn't reside where it should, and that those who have the most power reap the most benefits. And I think the power issue that we're dealing with is multidimensional. And there's sort of different ways to look at it. So one piece is on the technology and the business side, law and policy, and then civic participation. So on the technology and business side, it's very clear, if you've been at this conference, this is the third day of CPDP, this has been a common theme, that the market is consolidated, data is collected into data silos, there are walled gardens, which really restricts choice, it restricts access to innovation and choice in all sorts of different issues. And the market, especially around data, is very exploitative and extractive. The fact that data is still to this day often referred to as oil tells you a lot about what you need to know about how it is perceived, that it is by nature in the technology market, in particular, very extractive. And so there's a lot of power that resides there. On the law and policy front, this is also, a multidimensional issue. Sometimes laws can be either absent. There is the classic issue, especially in the context of technology, that technology moves very quickly, law moves a lot slower. And so law is always sort of playing catch up, and often, especially in the European process, it's very long. By the time it comes into force, it's almost outdated. So there is this classic problem, but sometimes law is either misguided, it's not enforced properly. We've been talking a lot about one of the shortcomings of the GDPR is that it's not adequately enforced, or it can be outdated. So this is one issue. And then the other issue, as I mentioned, is the lack of civic participation. So those who are most impacted by technology policy are never in the room and very seldom part of these very important policy conversations. And so there has been a lot more discussion, particularly as we talk about AI and issues around that those who are most vulnerable, who are marginalized, should be part of these discussions. But the barrier to entry is very, very high. So there needs to be much more engagement for those who are most impacted into these legislation. So there's a number of different power dynamics, and I know that can also seem challenging, and it's really hard sometimes to imagine how to do things differently, how to break these data silos, how to bring back competition, how to empower individuals specifically to reap the benefits of data and technology. And that's why these visioning exercises are so important, because we have to envision a positive future to get ourselves out of the status quo. So it was an absolute pleasure working with this group of experts, and there's a lot of really great provocations and questions that are raised in this process and in this paper. So I didn't want to leave on a negative note, because there are a lot of challenges. But
there are lots of challenges, but we're working on solutions collectively here at CPDP. Kasia, can I ask you for your reflections on where we are now and whether there is a power problem?
Yeah, talking about power problems always is a pleasure at this conference. In particular, I feel like so much has been said about the dominant platforms, large platforms, gatekeepers. This audience does not need more introduction to this area of problems. So let me zoom in on one specific, which affects mainly content-driven platforms, social media platforms, but by no means is only affecting those. But I think this example will best show the specific problem I want to draw your attention to. We know they are big, we know they serve as gatekeepers, we know they exploit effects of scale, and we need to fully understand what it means to have vertical integration of different layers of what we call a stack, a technological stack within their empires. Maybe it's obvious, maybe we keep forgetting it because it's so obvious. It's like the air we breathe in, that these platforms control the content, so the hosting, to some extent also the hardware used by their users, like Meta offering their hardware for free to make people more dependent. They control the flows of data, and they control the whole interface and algorithmic curation layer of the user experience. So at that point, if we want to participate, or if we feel forced, more often than not, we feel forced to participate in certain social networks, to host our content there, to share our content, to interact with people within these specific social networks, we cannot choose alternative interface. We cannot choose alternative algorithm that would do the content curation or content moderation. So what really matters for our well-being, for our access to information, for the type of experience we have within these networks. We cannot choose that aspect. It has been packed in one package, not for us to be negotiated. I think it's been so long that we got used to that even thinking that it could have been different, and using analogies from different sectors like banking, where we have payment services directive and interoperability within banks, banking services, or analogies from telco sector, almost seem somehow not adequate to the complexity of this ecosystem. And I'm not ignoring the barriers when it comes to data security, data privacy, the questions on how you operationalize it. We will get to this in a second round, I hope, when we talk about solutions. But the problem, the way we frame it, is that really the same agents, the same commercial agents control user experience throughout the whole thing, from sharing the content, uploading the content, to experiencing content uploaded by others, and everything that happens in between, which is key, because the fact that these large platforms observe our behavior online and analyze that observation translates into their analytical power of understanding who we are, understanding our needs, understanding our vulnerabilities, understanding trends, global trends, understanding consumer economic trends. And that adds to their gatekeeping position, to their power to then improve the service to the extent that is even harder for alternative services to come in and offer something equally appealing to consumers. So one aspect of that power to analyze data increases the market power, increases the gatekeeping problem. The other aspect of this is exploiting vulnerabilities, which is what I want to zoom in even more. To make it very clear, it's not only economic problem, it's not only market dominance problem, it's also human abuse issue. So the longer we accept the fact that these gatekeepers have all the knowledge about humans and can exploit that knowledge to manipulate our choices, our life views, our opinions, our access to information, the more we make ourselves subjected to this power. If we have to address both, we have to address the dominance and the market issue, and we have to address the human manipulation abuse issue, which both come down to the same business model. But if we only answer with more competition, if there are more Meta or more Googles or more Amazons competing with the same business model, we are not solving the latter. We are not solving the human abuse problem that became so visible through Facebook leaks. It became so visible in the current military conflict, when we see dramatic results of polarization, disinformation, people being fed with news and sponsored content that is not increasing not only their well-being, but even the awareness of what's going on in the world. So we are addressing here very deep societal problems that are intertwined with the business model. And this is what would be my offer for today, for the discussion.
Thank you, Kasia. Michael, can I turn to you? Just your reflections on where we are.
Thanks, everyone. I think one big trend we've seen over the last decade or two has been the increase in number of sensors that are collecting very, very sensitive data in our pockets or in our computers or in our environments, and the increased way we're interacting with these devices. So it's not just the generation of more data, but there's a lot that we can actually ask of this data, and that's creating a societal need or demand to use it and ask it. We've also seen a trend exacerbated by several factors of data and processing moving onto the device. That's both in terms of hardware being ready for machine learning models to be on devices, data not leaving the devices, and that's a mix of that pressure from data protection and privacy, but also pressure from intermediary liability, pressure from people companies not wanting to see data and content and to blind themselves from it. So lots of localization, edge computing, and so on has been a general trend that we'll see more of. And there's lots of good parts of this as well. But what it does, in a way, is it turns the conversation around data into a more complex one. We've often talked about data in terms of flows. Where does data go from one place to another, and let's govern it when it moves around. But when we think about data algorithms and data governance, we have to think of data and code as quite intertwined. Data and hardware is quite intertwined, and look at that stack that Kasia was mentioning when she was discussing, and look at the governance of that. Because only by doing that can we look at the governance of functionality, and that really is about data governance as well. What can data be purposed for? To what ends? Who's deciding this? Is it legitimate? What's the processes by which this is occurring? And this can create contentious issues because with new technologies, privacy-enhancing technologies, we can both ask legitimate and illegitimate questions of data that's on device, kept on the edge, kept confidential, and doesn't flow in ways that we might think are troubling. We can ask population-level analysis, and that can be anything from a genuine public health question that we want the answer to something that can be more troubling about political movements or organizations or so on, that population-level insights can be used to repress and to mold and to manage populations. We can also do personalization on devices that can be manipulative or can be beneficial. And so all of these things have open-ended functionality, so they're political and they're value-laden. The question is, who gets to decide about these functionalities, even when data is kept on device does not always flow? So challenge with things like the Data Act, challenge with things like the Data Governance Act. Imagine that data can move from place to place, and the solution is FRAND, fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory access to data, or new kinds of intermediaries. So we start to see this, and we start to see the contentious way that these issues are configured. We saw it around issues of contact tracing, for example, questions of who was involved in deciding which kind of protocols could run on devices. We see it now with client-side scanning in particular. We see it with Google Chrome and Privacy Sandbox, discussions of targeting on devices. This is functionality. Configuring this functionality is political. So I want to think about what does data governance look like in that context. We have to think about moving, I think, from relying on the configuration of code and platforms to be one that is primarily protective, say stopping states, particularly authoritarian regimes that might not have human rights built into them at all, from, say, breaking encryption or from spying on populations or so on. That's typically been a role that civil society and others have been willing to cede to platforms in this protective way. But as we move into a lot of sensitive data that can be configured for many purposes that are politically positive or useful, we have to ask who and how can we ask legitimate questions of data that's kept at the edge of networks, and who governs that? That's really tricky because it opens up questions to breaking encryption. It opens up these political Pandora's boxes that we don't want to discuss. But we have to move from protective to positive configurations. How do we do that? Requires a really solid governance regime. Also requires integrating jurisdictions that platforms don't even pick up the phone when they call because they're too small and economically unimportant. Because these are infrastructures that underlie our computational data and algorithmic realities.
Sorry, Michael, hand in your face there. Thank you very much. Paul, can you give us your final view on the problem and the power problem in particular, and then we will go into solutions?
Yes, certainly. I will start with what's happening now in Europe in contrast to the United States. I think we have been trying to put in place a first generation of instruments to constrain power of the big data players. And this will continue to be a theme, and this is not only an issue of competition law, it's also an issue of data protection law, in the sense that, you know, the question, what can you collect, what can you use it for, it's an issue of the DSA. So this will continue to be a work strand, namely constraining power, controlling power. And I think it is very important that this whole issue of data and algorithms and digitalization is increasingly discussed and seen also by the technological intelligence, the programmers, the makers of the devices, the people who work in this team and have the technical intelligence. They must always see the power element in what they're doing. And they have to ask themselves the question, you know, am I contributing to potential for power concentration? Am I contributing to an issue of or a tool, something which will help maybe also the abusive use of power? And the question is the power which I'm making possible, is it legitimate? This power that it accrues at a certain point in the structure, and is its exercise legitimate? So that will be an important theme for the future, and is a theme already in the present. The other work strand is a new empowerment of people, of individuals, but also a new empowerment of democracy. In the end, this whole discussion is about the primacy of democracy over technology. That is what this fight is about. What comes to us from America, from these companies, is a vision of tech totalitarianism where they actually are able to define politics, and the result we see in America. The result is a totally polarized society which is actually not able anymore to pass laws for the whole of the United States in Washington which constrain the power of these companies or which provide alternative empowerment. And I think in Europe, and this brings me to some elements of the report, we have an experience of totalitarianism which America doesn't share. We have seen fascism in Europe, we have seen communism in Europe, and so we have become not only sensitive about these issues of power grabbing, we have also become quite innovative in making sure that our societies don't go down that direction. And although we have issues of populism and autocratic regimes in Europe, I would say we also have developed after the Second World War models of at least hoping, which make us hope that we will not end up again in such systems of total irrelevance of the individual, or for that matter, total dictatorship. So what are these? And there are many elements here, but I would like to mention two which were also important in our work. First is the experience that we need public infrastructures. Not everything can be left to market and to market power, because market power tends to concentrate. And in the digital, that is extreme. I mean, the 5 big GAFAM we are talking about, they are constantly between number 1 and number 10 of the US stock exchange. They are the most capitalized companies in the world and growing at an exponential speed still. So not everything can be left to the market for that reason, but also because the market power becomes political power, and it now today with data and all the targeting and analyzing of people, it becomes power not only of the political collectivity of the democratic process, but over each individual. And so we have in Europe chosen to have public infrastructures. And since you mentioned the banks, it's not only the payments directive which introduces a new element in competition. Well, we do actually in Europe have a mix between public and private banks, and that's good because not everything is in the hand just of capitalistic structures at the stock exchange. We have very strong public banks in Europe. If you think about media, we have a strong tradition in Europe of public media. The BBC, of course, being the classic example, but also in many other member states, we have a mix of media between private, market-driven, advertising-driven printing press, some private TV, and public TV. So one thing I think we need to start working on more for the future, and now I'm looking at the perspective of this report, our idea was to look into the future 20, 30 years, is let's imagine a future where we can organize ourselves in other forms, and where Google, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, Apple, they don't exist anymore. Just imagine that. I think we have to have such exercises. We should not fall into the trap of thinking they are indispensable. So how would that look? What type of infrastructures would we need? How would we organize them? And when we start thinking in this direction, then we can go back halfway and say, well, maybe we should start with some public infrastructures. For example, public infrastructure for a European public in terms of the space where our opinion building starts for democracy. We already know that today 50% of our population, and it's in the United States not different, build their political opinion on the internet. Well, Are we going to leave that space totally private, or are we going to create platforms, public platforms, where political information is spread over the internet in a way the BBC provides public information and political information to people in the UK and elsewhere, and many public TV stations, for example, do that in other parts. So that's one element I think we have to talk about. The other element is that I think we need in democracy public authorities, governments and parliaments to take more responsibility to organize a diversity of counterpower. So this is not only about competition law, allowing market entry, which is an element of counterpower. New entrants must be able to challenge the incumbents, but this also applies to a duty to do more to allow civil society to function well and to be, let's say, the thorn in the side. This can not only be left to public authorities which enforce the law, but we need players which also have which should have rights to enforce in a different way, which are also independent. So again, here there is this new diversity which we have to create, and it should not just be a diversity of statistics and looking good. It must be real, and I would say democracy has to take charge of making this happen.
Thanks, Paul. Now thinking about these utopic visions of the future, thinking about some of the responses and the responses that are outlined in the report, and the 4 themes that Valentina pointed to in her slideshow. So I'm going to ask you questions about those main themes. I'm going to ask you to try and limit your interventions to 4 minutes, so we've got plenty of time for discussion amongst ourselves, but also with our brilliant audience. So first, Kasia, how can we break infrastructure dependencies? And I'm going to time everyone so we keep to the time.
Thank you, please do. I'm in a comfortable position because Paul already gave you the big vision where we would like to get. And now imagine we are somewhere halfway. So we still have dominant platforms. We still have majority of people there. I hate calling them users, so I won't, but you can imagine I refer to people using these services when I say people. So you have a number of people who are not willing to move on because they don't really imagine a different experience, because they are motivated to stay within the social networks they know, because they run businesses there, or they have schools, or whatever reason. They want to stay there. They have their content hosted, and other people host content in within these ecosystems, but they are fed up, to say the least, with the experience they are receiving, because they no longer want to be manipulated. They no longer want to have their vulnerabilities exploited against them with targeted advertising or specific recommender systems that make them simply engaged at any price, engaged at the price of receiving valuable content like news, credible news, or simply the type of content they really want. Nobody's asking them what they really want, correct? This is advertiser-driven ecosystem. So people want to change that part of the experience. Is this possible? In our opinion, in our provocation, it's pretty simple. It's taking one step beyond what we already have in the DSA and DMA, which is already a step towards these 2 legal acts already introduced to some extent horizontal interoperability between services like messengers. Very old concept. If I can send an SMS to any phone, why couldn't I send a messenger message to Signal and vice versa? That part is easy, but can we take another step and say, okay, imagine the stack that has layers, we separate layers, and within each layer, we open competition of core services, not additional services, not like a filter I can introduce on the top of Facebook's newsfeed. No, I replace the newsfeed with the newsfeed I trust. I replace the algorithm that is gaming me, that is treating me like eyeballs, that is engaging me at any price, with the type of algorithm I trust, or I choose, or I want to pay for. And that brings me to Paul's point in how do we ensure that these alternative services have different business model behind them? How do we ensure that it's not just competition of more Facebooks over my attention repetition and repeating the same problems. That probably leads us back to public infrastructure, to rethinking how to take the money to fund these services. Is this going to be public money or non-profit models? Maybe we need NGOs offering alternative algorithms. I don't know exactly how to build these business models. We didn't go as far in our deliberation, but the first step to even open that market, it doesn't have to be commercial market, but just open the possibility for alternatives. It starts with full vertical and horizontal interoperability, both data related and functionality related, which is for technologists nothing new under the sun. We can design that. It's not a technological problem, it's a political problem to reimagine fully open modular ecosystem where each of the core services, including even advertising, which is the money-making machine, can be replaced with alternative. If we have that, we can start brainstorming how to bring ethical alternatives that will solve the second aspect of the problem I described in my first intervention. So not just the market dominance problem, but the fairness and abuse and human vulnerability exploitation problem. We need to fix that in the first place. For me, interoperability is only a step towards that solution. And clearly that solution is about money. That solution is about institutions. That solution is about funding ethical business models. Maybe not even business models. Maybe it can't be business anymore. I don't know. So these are the difficult open questions. But before we even get to the difficult open questions, we need to acknowledge the need for full vertical and horizontal interoperability. Do I have more time or?
No, I'm going to actually ask the panel a question following up from that. You talk about, these. How do we make room for new business models to emerge? How do we open that up? That open question that you said we had. Does anyone want to intervene on that? Take the collective breathe in as maybe a no.
Well, I remember our discussions about the interoperability of social networks. So I think we need to have the self-confidence, and I would also invite the technological intelligentsia to not immediately say, no, it's not possible. Let's just think about this a moment. We have Facebook. Can we imagine that there is another network which provides social networking services, and where then the people are able to see their friends on Facebook, but according to the rules the network they have chosen? So not according to the rules of Facebook, but to their rules. And can we imagine that, for example, a newspaper publisher makes such a network and adds to network membership the free access, or as part of the package, access to the exclusive content of this newspaper publishing service? I think it could be a business model. We see that in the press market there is a divide taking place. The New York Times is a very successful. 10 million people on the internet read the New York Times. If we would have interoperability, probably they would be able to offer an alternative social network combined with their exclusive content. Is this technologically possible? I think yes. Well, we just have to dare moving in this direction.
Paul, I stopped Cassius, I'm going to stop you. Michael, two Brits talking to each other, this sounds bad, but how do we reclaim control over data and repurpose it for societal benefits?
Referenda on all platform decisions, I think. Okay, so firstly, I think there's multiple stages in this. And we've got some of the way on some of them, which is nice, but we've also got zero of the way on others. Firstly, it's about just removing some of the completely mad background conditions that have been allowed to accumulate over time. So things like the Digital Markets Act help take us a bit of the way there. They are about breaking down some of the terrible background conditions that have not been regulated as we went along. Many of you will be familiar with the DMA and its provisions, and other countries are doing similar things. So that's good. We could go further. I think the background conditions will not be perfect after the DMA. So we need to go further and keep on that and keep thinking about what background conditions in platforms will be necessary. Secondly, we see, as I mentioned back originally, the power that's in our devices that's being orchestrated, really. Algorithms can run in a more decentral way, can be decided by somebody else. They can be changed. Functionality of devices can be changed overnight, bricked, altered. So this is an infrastructure, and in a way it's a public infrastructure, and in a way that comes with procedural obligations. It comes with obligations of transparency, of road mapping, of making legitimate decisions, in issues that will come up in the DMA as well, such as trade-offs between privacy and security and so on. Those need to be made in an accountable way. And by accountable, it means they talk to a fore about the decision, they evidence them, and their decision can ultimately be overturned or challenged with a sufficient capacity and understanding from the accountable, the group that the people are accountable to, the platforms, the infrastructures are accountable to. Because otherwise, without this, you just get complete tyranny over the state of this infrastructure. And then lastly, I think we have to start envisaging what rights and obligations individuals, groups, countries, blocks, anything have to make positive changes to these infrastructures. And by positive, I mean active, to change them in certain ways, to alter their functionality, and what safeguards we have on those changes and those processes, and what those safeguards look like. Because otherwise, even making no change is a political choice. Like if a crisis happens and a platform refuses to make a change, that too is political. So we do clearly need some ability for different actors to intervene. Those could be anything from individuals using devices to businesses to countries to the EU to all of these kind of areas. We don't have a good theory of this. We don't have a good practice of this right now. It's daunting and it's scary for civil society people because they feel they might lose a lot of the gains that have only been protected, particularly post-Snowden, by companies and by encryption. But we have to deal with that because it's the only way we're going to get a mature and political digital environment where we can talk about values. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael. Does anyone want to follow up on what? Please, Reagan.
So I think there's a lot of work to be done around changing incentives, especially in business. So there's sort of two problems around incentives that would be great if they could change. So one, particularly thinking about large platforms and social media and tech companies in particular, is this issue and obsession around growth, hyper growth and constantly creating profit for shareholders. And this continues to drive this obsession with growing, accumulating power, owning more verticals, and consolidating. So this has led to this false idea that we have this false myth about this invisible hand and that competition and the best and the smartest and the most innovative will win. It's just not true. And so this has really led to an accumulation and a consolidation of power in the market, and it continues to grow. And very much related to that, particularly in the platform and social media space, is the issue around attention. This is really what drives a lot of the data economy or the data surveillance economy, is getting eyeballs on the site, the product, for as long as possible. And what keeps eyeballs there in order to maximize profits for advertisers is the most polarizing, and most engaging content, let's say. And what we've seen over the past several years is what those business incentives actually can reap on society. These are very big societal issues. Everything that we've seen from genocide to stable democracies and election processes. So these have very large consequences. So I think if we want to change these systems, we really need to look at the absolute core incentives that are driving this power and all of these issues. And I really think if we can change those incentives, for instance, wean off of data, then it starts to break the cycle of growth and attention and this sort of vicious cycle that we find ourselves in often.
That's a really great point. I'm sure we could discuss this in a lot of detail, but Paul, I'd like to turn to you. How can we rebalance the center of power through new institutions?
Well, I mean, there are many experiences in democracy, how to do checks and balances, and I would say, as a general rule, democracy is built for decentralization. So there's the division of power between the executive, the government, the legislator, the judiciary, and the fourth estate, journalism, the critical investigation, and I would also say as another estate in the state is the independent academia. And many of these actors are being, let's say, in their independence actually undermined by the money coming from these huge corporations. If you think about it, in journalism, first, 80% of all online advertisement go to two companies in the world, Google and Facebook, and then afterwards they graciously dole out in press programs money to the press and create dependencies on them and great friendships which probably prepare them to enter the content journalism market. And the same is happening in science. I mean, please find me a professor whose institute, I'm not talking about every person, but whose institute does not in one way or other get money from these companies when they do research, when the institute does research on the societal impact of digitalization and the internet. Very difficult these days. So what can we do about this? I think follow the money is a very important theme, but also the principle of decentralization. I mean, controlling power is the key task of democracy in the 21st century, and it's not only about controlling the power of the state, but we say these governments have power, so we have to apply what we have learned, how we control the power of the state, we have to apply it to these companies, which means separation of functions. Separation of functions means that we cannot allow the logic of the platform economy to just freewheelingly move on and take over one sector after the other, because that is the logic of the platform economy, leveraging the power which you have in one area and then take over the next, and the theme is software eats it all at the end. So we have to develop themes and policies of forcing separation of functions. For example, in the US Congress, there are draft laws which say, platforms shouldn't be allowed to bring banking services. That's just one example, but I can imagine many other examples of how we force separation of powers. For example, in the lifespan, I mean, I'm frightened by the idea that we have corporations which already today, through their school programs, they give free devices, Google and Microsoft, they give free devices to school and even kindergarten. Well, they can follow a human from the cradle to the death with their analytics, their data collection, and so on. Well, that should be broken. I would say the big data collectors should not in any way be in schools. So also all these education programs they offer, no, they should do other things, but not there. Not to have the possibility to follow a human from birth and to profile from birth to death. One example of separation of functions. And there are many others. I can say 2 weeks ago I met people from the anti-monopoly movement in the United States. They actually told me that they are convinced the American population in their majority would like to see Amazon to be broken up into 4 or 5 functions: delivery, marketplace, producer, and cloud services. In all of these areas, on its own, even if broken up, they are the biggest. Amazon is already the biggest delivery company in America. It's the biggest e-commerce marketplace, the biggest cloud provider anyway. So I think we have to learn to think in these categories, and the next step will be to then also do it and implement it with the tools which we have in law in Europe and in the United States. And if we see that the tools of law are not sufficient, in particular that is an issue in the United States, then democracy has to take charge. And I think that is first of all a challenge now for the United States. Europe has done its way, and I very much hope that American democracy is able to deliver on these counts.
Thanks, Paul. Doing very well with sticking to 4 minutes here. Reagan, you talk in your initial introduction about increased public participation in tech policy making and just policy making more broadly. That is presented as one of the solutions in the report. Could you draw on that in a bit more detail with your 4 minutes?
Sure. So the paper goes into different ideas and provocations to engage civic participation. Because if we want policies to be better and laws to be better, then those who are impacted by them should be part of that process. And one of the first sort of major steps of that is to acknowledge structural imbalances. Structural imbalances in our societies, in laws, in policies, in processes everywhere. And key to that is really understanding in terms of harm, that harm is distributed unevenly across society. And those who are, marginalized identities, vulnerable people, have the most to lose from bad policy. They are the most victims of predictive policing, of government surveillance, of AI discrimination, all of these issues that many of us who are in a privileged position only talk about as potential impacts. So it's very important to acknowledge that when thinking about a policy, law, implementation, the whole stack of the sausage-making process, let's say. And so one part is to acknowledge it. I think a lot of this actually relates to mindset. So I think the follow-up question, Ravi, will be, what are the legislative opportunities? But I don't even think we need law or legislation around this. We need to be thinking critically about ourselves and our processes and how we can actually not only acknowledge, but actually put this into practice. And so there's sort of two things I would just like to highlight. One is on the conception of rights, and then two is on the participation element. So one, we need to think about in terms of harm and rights more in terms of the collective and not just the individual. Those data protection nerds of us who have been going to CPDP for 10 years think about the narrative, particularly, for instance, around the GDPR was very much for the past 10 years focused on the individual. That we need to power individuals to understand their rights, to take control of their data. And even in my years at Mozilla, this was very much the view of Mozilla was empower the individual to know how to protect their privacy. And the reality is that is a very privileged position because it requires a lot of knowledge and understanding and access. And so now it's really important to think about the collective. I know these discussions have been happening around the AI Act and more, but we really need to see more of it. And I want to be clear that I don't mean either or, I mean an and. So in the context of rights, we should always be thinking about an abundance mindset in that more is more. So individual rights are really important. We have the GDPR, and we need to be thinking about collective rights. So today, how data is so pervasive, we can all be victims of data issues and data misuse, even without giving away your data. So we really need to think about groups of people, vulnerable people, how that can work. And in terms of legislation, things like collective redress, these types of things are super, super important. In the company mindset, this can look like, instead of toggles and settings, thinking about privacy by default. Just raise the bar completely so everyone gets access to good privacy. That's an example of that. And on the second point, on participation, so the paper explores how to engage civic participation, right? So I know whenever I have these conversations, people kind of assume this kind of wild binary between the status quo and everything going to public referendum. And given the nature of how easy it is to be manipulated online, and that can be really stress-inducing, but I think there's a lot in between here of how to engage experts, and governments generally can do a lot better in engaging people. So just a couple of really quick examples. I will use the Commission as an example because we're in Brussels and this is the core of my experience, but I think a lot of this applies to governments who want to have more active participation. So one is considering more active participation or active consultation rather than something more passive. So the European Commission, for instance, before they launched legislation, we all know, many of us who have been in this field for a long time, they launched these public consultations that are open and transparent and free for anyone to answer. But that is also not necessarily open and transparent because only those who have the time, the knowledge, the privilege can really participate in that. So what you end up having is a lot of private interest groups and very little participation. So one could imagine where the commission or a government could actively participate specific or consult specific groups. And yeah, so I think that's definitely one way. Another way, and then I'll stop, but just wanted to give some concrete examples, is to think about like better vetting of those who are invited to consult. In my over 10 years of working on tech policy in Brussels, I have been to many a parliament hearing or stakeholder meetings where you have either astroturfing organizations or academics, and like a very basic sort of LinkedIn check will tell you, who they may be paid by. And so I think even just more active and thorough vetting of who is at the table, and just generally, and again, this mindset shift, who is in the room? Can we answer this question? Do we have the experience? It seems basic, but these are the kinds of questions that not only governments, but also organizations and anyone making policy or engaging in the policymaking process should really be thinking through. So I think those are some of the examples, many of which are elaborated in the report, that would help to increase civic participation and therefore increase the quality of tech policy and the implementation.
Thank you, Reagan. Thank you all. I've got lots of questions, but because one of the beauties of CPDP is everyone in this room is an expert and has really great insights, and we've still got 20 minutes, so I'd love to open the floor out to questions if people have some. There's lots of hands already.
Comments as well.
Maybe they should queue up.
Ideas.
There's a mic going round. Here
Hello.
we go. Hi.
I am Maria de Villeneuve. I work in BNP Paribas. And I was just surprised that the topic of education came so late. Personally, I feel like that's something that's so important. I'm seeing a lot of really great long-term solutions that are very exciting, but I feel like there's so much that needs to be done now. There's information that's just not passing. When I look at 99% of people around me who are not data protection nerds, they still keep telling me, why is it important? Why does it matter? Why should I care? And those are issues that I don't understand why the government is not, making communication campaigns about this. Why in schools, when they're given a tablet, they're not told, how do you use this tablet for your mental health? How you should be utilizing this information? Why you're not told, that your apps don't have real-time notification? They're waiting to give you a dopamine fix for physical addiction. Like these things, even if I don't want to put the burden on the people to protect themselves, to some extent, these solutions are extremely long-term, and we need immediate knowledge and information for people around us to really start realizing these elements. So I'm just surprised I'm not seeing this in government. Why and in what way could that be put in place, basically?
That's a really good, I think that's a really good question. Does anyone want to give an answer to that first? Okay.
I take it as a comment, a very good one, thank you. Just my comment back, there are conditions for the change we imagine that we take as obvious, and obviously education, digital education, critical thinking would be one of them, but placing a burden on educated individuals would be exactly against the sort of change we envisage here. So I believe I'm probably talking for the group now, that we all wanted to identify the barriers in the ecosystem that make even educated individuals fall into the same traps and make them vulnerable. So it's not like saying education that is not important, not at all. We do see this as important factor, kind of like environment in which this is all immersed. But even if we educate individuals on its own, it will not change the ecosystem that is now constrained with lack of institutions, lack of regulation, lack of interoperability. So our thinking was, how do we change the ecosystem rather than how do we change society that obviously needs to come along and help us in that process.
I think it's also, education is great, but it's also quite demoralizing to be educated against something that you can't do anything about,
Exactly.
especially around incumbent structures, and it might actually have a reverse effect if we don't pair it very tightly with other things.
Mm-hmm.
There's two very good answers. We've got a question at the front here, just behind you there. If you could start. Oh, you've already got one.
Hi, Andrea. I'm a researcher at Imperial College London and also at Oxford, and I'm also working with the EDPB on the new guidelines on anonymization and pseudonymization. So as Valentina reminded us first, let's say the scope of data protection has always been defined as personal data, right? What is personal is under data protection, and what is anonymous is not under data protection. But it seems to me that quite a lot of power-related issues actually are related and exploit data that is anonymous. So my question is whether we should rethink, let's say, the scope of data protection. And I have a second question for Paul. Michael said that it might be necessary for civil society to, let's say, release a bit the clinging on some rights that have been, let's say, enforced finally after the Snowden revelations, such as encryption. I think let's say this. I can understand why this might be necessary, and there is a tension between security and interoperability, for example. Not everything that companies emphasize on this aspect is probably true, but there exists a tension. What I'm wondering is whether, let's say, we can trust the act of releasing the clinging on these rights when there are proposals like the CSAM client scanning proposal by the Commission that really pose a danger, I think, on these rights.
Thank you. Michael, do you want to respond?
So I could clarify. I wasn't saying rights on encryption. The point is we don't have rights for encryption. The point is that we rely on companies just to do things, and we don't know actually what's happening behind the scenes. The point is we have to release our reliance on completely, effectively ungoverned organizations to, out of the goodness of their heart, configure systems in a way that currently stands up to governments. I don't think we can rely on that now. That's what I'm saying. I'm not saying we loosen encryption.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to follow up on the comment that was made? Paul, do you want to?
Yeah, I think when it comes to power over democracy, there's, of course, the aspect of seeing like a state, which may have a lot of non-personal data included. But when it comes to power over democracy in the sense over the voters, that's very much based on personal data. So I think to say that much of the power is based on other data than personal data, I think that would be risky. I think big parts of the targeting power, for example, now in elections, and a big part of the power to create a weather and a societal climate which is conducive to the legislative change this company wants, is based on personal data. This being said, I think the power potential, but also the economic potential of non-personal data is under scrutinized. I would say, in particular in Europe, that many businesses spend a lot of time bitching about GDPR while not paying attention and actually not doing, in terms of business models, making the money they could make with non-personal data.
Now, just to add the point that the report indeed covers that aspect. I won't go into details for the sake of time, but I think it totally deserves a separate zoom in and a separate session, maybe next year. CVDP, we could co-organize that. Exactly how to treat the non-personal data and what are the risks and challenges there, especially for groups, trends, understanding the world and use of that knowledge also against humans at the end of the day, but not through targeted services or personalization. So we do cover that, and there are recommendations in the report covering non-personal data as well, but I won't go into details now.
Read the report, I think, is the short answer to that. Is there another question?
Yeah, Giancarlo Margeri, Brussels Privacy Hub. I wanted to build on what Regan was saying and the emphasis she was putting on public participation, not just in the lawmaking, but in the design of AI, right? But what we have in the GDPR, in the PIA, participation is where you want, where possible, very, very secondary. The AI Act, Article 55, puts participation in the voluntary codes of conduct and not even an emphasis on vulnerable people participating. Do we have some practical, at least bottom-up model that we can use for participation, something that already exists about vulnerable people impacted by AI practices that participate in the design, how we select them, do we select experts or witnesses, and so on. This would be great to start in practice the discussion. Thank you.
Yes.
Regan, do you want to deal with it first?
Actually, Kasia just told me that I think there's an ADA paper exactly about this.
Kasia, do you want to explain?
Does someone
from ADA want to?
Valentina, or does someone from ADA want to? Because
I think we've got Imogen
Imogen
from
here.
ADA.
Just advertising.
Surprise guest here.
Shall I just lean in?
Yeah.
Hi.
Take the one behind you, the speaker.
On
There's a
the podium.
microphone.
On the
That's
podium.
easier.
Ada for the podium.
So, are those mics on?
No.
No? Should I keep talking?
Do you want to just use this one?
Should I just lean into that one?
Ah, the sound person
how's
is
that?
not there.
It's okay.
Yes.
Just to say thanks, that's a really great question, and that's something that we work on a lot in ADA. One of our core methodologies is around public participation, and I will just quickly plug a couple of reports which I can circulate. We've done work on participatory data governance, so exactly looking at how you can bring in publics, what the right methodologies are and the right structures, not just for the design of policy, but also for ongoing governance. And we've done some work on participatory methods, for example, in algorithmic impact assessments in the NHS as well. So I'll share those links.
Yeah. Can I just say something on the law and the law making participation possible or even obligatory? We don't have to reinvent the world. If you ask for practical examples, well, one of the most practical examples is co-determination in labor law. There are countries like Germany and others which have laws which oblige participation of the vulnerable, namely the workers. We have to relearn this. I mean, the tech intelligentsia, they don't know about these. They find this strange, unions and co-determination. Yeah, but, I can only just say, open your eyes. Humanity has made progress in this area. And it's not so that progress has only started in the moment the digital was invented and the next algorithm and AI is the beginning of progress. There are examples, and let's dig them up and insert them into this new technological age.
Agreed. I think it's...
Yeah, social dialogue, but there is. I think the question was a good one, because what I heard from the question was there are laws which say if possible and and softy, and what I wanted to say is there are some laws which are pretty hard. 50-50 co-determination in companies, in the steel industry in Germany. That's real power and participation, and it's not just being heard and having a seat in a forum where in the end the majority of the others decide. It's because the danger of participation is, probably the tech companies would have no problem to listen, but the question is who decides at the end. And also there we have examples, and this is in the end all about politics and who you vote for. You get the laws of the majority which have been voted into the European Parliament. The if possible and where appropriate, it comes from certain political parties. I mean, let's not kid ourselves. It has nothing to do with tech this, tech that. It's simple party political matters.
I would have a differing view in that, yes, the political dimension definitely has a lot to play, but absolutely those who are here in Brussels or in these policy-making spaces who have the most resources, who have the most people and experts that they can throw, who can control the narrative, they absolutely have a huge impact on the process, the outcome, the implementation. The paper goes in a lot to talk about corporate capture, and I think that's a huge element we have to consider. And I don't even know if it can be prevented. I think that was one of the sort of provocations: can we prevent it? But we definitely, anyone making policy needs to be designing strategies to mitigate and protect against this. If they do care about a democratic process and an outcome that actually benefits people and their own countries and regions. So that's super important. And then I also just wanted to, there's a really important word there's two different words. Like one word was co-design and another was dialogue. And I think it's so important to think about what kind of consultation we're talking about. Again, in all of the dialogues that I've been in, I've often been the token civil society person invited to a dialogue, and that's not enough. So I think co-design would be a whole other step. Where even civil society experts or independent experts or those impacted or labor, et cetera, could be involved in actually helping in the early stages to actually design and think about these, tricky issues and what this could look like. And so that's a whole, I think, different participatory level that it would be great to see the Commission and other governments sort of embracing this more active participation.
Is there any more questions?
Yeah. Hi, Daniel Lufer from Access Now. I'm sorry for introducing the word blockchain. But
Might have to sit down straight away.
If you put that title, Power Over Data and Algorithms, Can We Get It Back, into an autocomplete, what you'll get is Web3 as a solution too. And I think the conversation, the critique of business models, the critique of centralization is kind of where it was 2 years ago. But in the meantime, big venture capital funds, Andreessen Horowitz, all of these have come in, have co-opted decentralization, have co-opted new business models, and are proposing something different, but in my mind, definitely not better. The tokenization economy may not be surveillance capitalism, but it's based on a financialization of every aspect of human interaction. So just do any of the panelists have thoughts about how we keep up with the fact that industry, these centralized, very powerful interests, are sort of using technically decentralized systems to, again, further consolidate their power?
I have one small thought, which is also links to the previous question, the challenge of actual participation. A lot of the background conditions are decided way before a system is put into place or even imagined, through standardization processes, through things that are very arcane. It's very hard to imagine what the high-capacity organizations, like Reagan was talking about, have the ability to envisage what the future looks like from a really arcane standards process earlier on. It's exactly the same thing with any decentralized protocol. You design the background conditions incorrectly, you cannot fix this with consultation, co-design on completely broken foundations. But it's very hard to have co-design participation in an abstract arcane process that happens really upstream from any application. And that's the tension we have to work out, and that requires politicizing a lot more technology than we're currently doing.
Yeah, just to embrace the comment, we exactly follow that path in thinking that there's no single intervention, there's no single transformation of the ecosystem, and Valentina presented a whole roadmap for this. The way we thought is we are building a new ecosystem composed of many elements that need to work together, because each and every of them can be broken, can be co-opted, can be still abused for exactly the same purposes we criticized at the very beginning. So exactly, part of the report is criticism of the obvious solutions, like decentralize, give data to data intermediaries, create data pods, move data to the edge. We are aware that the risks are multiple, and the same power struggle will happen in reinvented ecosystems as well. That's why we imagine institutions as being so important, and the very honest discussion we are starting here today is about how to protect these institutions from getting co-opted again. It comes down to money, it comes down to incentives, a key factor. How do you improve incentives? I mean, I don't know. I guess it's a social psychology issue or a moral issue or a philosophical question, but we are not avoiding them, and they are covered in the discussion in the report. I hope we can zoom in on more specific issues in next discussions to come.
Can I add in just?
Yeah, of course. We've only got 2 minutes.
2 minutes?
Everyone, yeah, I know.
Yeah,
It's very quickly, hasn't it?
Yeah,
Yes, we get one more question.
We get one more question, then I'm going to ask you all to maybe just have a quick chat amongst yourself, then we'll say goodbye with our final question.
Yeah, thank you. Alessandro Mantelero, Politecnico Torino. I have a quick question, but first a comment on participation. It's true that participation we have already modeled like in labor law, but in labor law the people are identified and are organized. In online it's different. The people are not be aware to belong from the same group. The second point is you mentioned assessment, competition rule. I fully agree with you, are good instrument. A bit more skeptical about the role of the state, because of the state there are different ways in which the state can interact, and not necessarily always in the benefit of the citizen. So I think that we should be aware about the role of the state, to emphasize too much the role of the state, not to have a sort of dystopic view. We see the good state and we imagine that. And the final one is, what is for you the free model, an alternative model? Because you say this model doesn't work, it's based on advertising, this model doesn't work because it's based on data. I fully agree. but how you can implement an alternative model, consider the dimension, the socio-technical dimension of this model. Thank you.
You have minus a few minutes left to answer these questions. So please, I'll pass the mics over for maybe just final comments with some of that thoughts in mind. I know you all had a lot more to say.
I think one point on the last point is that this is going to be complex and institutional, and it's going to be creative and inventive, and it's going to have to deal with challenges like the state and different actors. It's not been done before. We haven't really governed infrastructures in a really global way like this. These institutions need creativity, and that's what we haven't seen from so many regulatory proposals recently. We have to get more creative and more political about how we want technology to be governed.
So to the point on the role of the state, I know it's quite Eurocentric to sort of trust in the state, and there's the Charter of Fundamental Rights, and that is a sort of whole way of understanding policy and the role of government. And in different contexts globally, sometimes you don't want the state being involved, and there is a massive complexity around that with the role of companies and platforms and governments and how they all interact. So we do need to constantly be conscious that what we're saying in certain contexts, say in Brussels or Europe, is not necessarily to be copied and repeated, but that context is everything. And it's very important to understand the specific context in the region in which you're operating. So I take that point well. And then to end on Daniel's point, thank you for bringing up Web3. I think that that is a concern that many of us have if we don't actually address the structural problems that we're dealing with. And it's so interesting looking at this transition from Web 2 to 3 and how much techno-utopian dialogue is here again, even though many of us were alive in the late 90s, active, and so technology is not going to save us. Going to another platform without changing the business models, without rethinking about how we can do things differently, without changing these exploitative practices is not going to change a thing. And the power will remain in the hands of the very few at the very top, and they have already started to consolidate that space. And speaking of inclusivity, who's building that space? There's not enough, again, marginalized, different vulnerable people. I see a lot of, excited white dudes that want, technology to save us again. And we just can't repeat the same thing. It's barely been 20 years, so let's not.
I'm aware we're over time, but everyone's still here, so I don't know, are we allowed to just do a couple more minutes? I'm looking at...
There is a break, that's why.
There's a break, so
there
they're
is
not
a break,
moving.
so nobody's moving, so we'll
hands are
just
still up.
maybe finish up. So Kasia and Paul, do you want to do some final comments?
Yeah, no, I strongly, I could only do a strong plus one to Reagan's rant on let's not repeat the same failed narrative of a single group of people or a single method saving us here. We need to rethink the ecosystem. I know how difficult it is. Today's discussion only teases out some of the obvious questions. We go to public institutions, the question comes, what about evil state? We go to institutions that are private, the question is how do we prevent co-optation? We go to infrastructure, the question is how do you prevent the same or new infrastructure being abused once again by the same players? So it is ecosystemical problem, if that word exists. We have to attack it from many angles, and our report is just a set of provocations coming from different angles, but far from final answers. I can only appeal to this community to just help us and work together on finding some of the answers. It won't happen next month, but maybe within a year or two we can reflect on these new paths of re-engineering the ecosystem rather than fixing it, because it cannot be fixed in no single point.
Paul, before you interject, I think we have another question. This is like Woodstock for data protection here.
Thanks. The freedom of assembly is an individual right for everyone that is useful for the collective.
Oh boy.
The worker consultation is for worker collectives. Minority languages in certain media is also for those collectives. So my question is, because Reagan mentioned we need more collective rights, do you have examples for concrete collective rights, which that would be, as to any of the panelists? Thank you.
I think before we do more questions, I'm just going to say thank you very much to Ada Lovelace and the amazing report that you've put together and the amazing work to start this conversation. I'm aware a lot of people are leaving. I just wanted to make sure Ada were properly recognised before everyone starts to go. So thank you, Ada, for putting this on. In terms of continued conversation, I think our panellists, not going to let them out because I've got the way out. So we could take a few more questions. I think, do the sound engineers?
There was a question there.
Okay, let's answer that one question and then maybe we'll do one more and then we have to...
collect three questions.
Let's collect three. This is it. This is your final go, guys.
On the left.
We've got one here on the left.
Here.
Just down here.
What? Micro. Here at the first row.
First row. And we've got one more.
Hello. Hi.
Yes.
My name is Jaya, and I have one foot in academia at the Weizenbaum Institute as a geographer, and another foot in the very white male space of Web3. I work for a company called NIM Technologies, a decentralized privacy system, and we are incorporating a token. It is that kind of dangerous territory of like, okay, what happens? Are you just hyper financializing the infrastructure that you're building? But I would also like to say that the discussions that are happening in that space, for all their flaws, is exactly trying to tackle the question of the business model, right? And I would actually welcome a lot more engagement with the space exactly for those reasons. Like, it's very easy to dismiss it all because there's plenty of problems with that space, but it is also a space that's trying to look at some of the kind of nitty-gritty around the economic dynamics. So that's one point. And then the other point that I wanted to make was the way that regulation oftentimes gets discussed is very much in terms of mitigation and compliance. As someone who has, yes, a foot in kind of social sciences, but also definitely a foot in the kind of technology industry, and as a technologist, I would actually welcome an approach to regulation that also really sees it as a kind of invitation for a different type of innovation. And here I'm thinking kind of basically about funding, and I'm thinking about like, okay, when new regulation is put on the table, that new regulation needs to be supported with a lot of funding around innovation that is spurred on by that piece of regulation, right? So when we're thinking about the GDPR, you don't just end up with some stupid cookie settings thing as the kind of technologist response to that. No, you actually want a total shift in mentality from the technologists themselves towards a different direction, and you need incentives to do that, which means you need funding to do that. So I would welcome like pairing regulation really with like actual support in technological innovation that goes in a different pathway.
So 2 questions enough, do you think?
And maybe one more, yeah.
Or maybe panel are hungry for questions here. Sorry.
Yeah, these are good comments.
Yeah, these are great comments.
Can I? Thank you very much. Alexis Ardiashvili, University of Leiden. My question is about European data strategy and how far it is to provide the tools for the long-term solutions that you mentioned. For example, horizontal and vertical interoperability and DMA. Like, what's going on there? Yeah, thank you.
Good questions. Collective redress, innovation through regulation or with regulation, and European data strategy. Who wants to go where?
Well, let me say that if you take all the 8 legislative instruments, also the Data Governance Act with the new data intermediaries, the Data Act, the question of access to private data for alternative use in the public interest, but maybe also for startups. I think there are a lot of elements in the present packages of legislation going through, and we have also huge financing programs going in parallel. So I think there is a lot of music, but I would also say it is important to think already, in a perspective of 20 or 30 years beyond the existing. By the way, I think right at the beginning of our panel, we talked the word evidence-based policymaking was pronounced. I think we have to change tack on this. We need imagination-based policymaking, because this space is moving so fast, innovation and business models, that we cannot make good policy on the basis of the empirics of yesterday, or for that matter, or only based on the experience. I mean, as much as I plead for, please look around in your world, there are many things humans have created before the digital which are useful in the digital, and we should transfer them. At the same time, I think we must be ready to make new rules based also where we have no evidence, but we have a strong imagination that things can really go wrong. Last remark on the relationship between the private markets innovation and what I would call innovation steered by democratic lawmaking, because of course there are many examples of what you're asking for. I mean, much of the environmental legislation is aspirational. It sets standards which today's technology doesn't provide, doesn't actually give a lot of money, but industry is normally saying, oh, it's impossible, but in the end they can do it. So I would say it is very unlikely, I think, that the market will provide in the digital, and for me the tokenization is an example, will provide solutions which will be sustainable public interest solutions in the long run. It's very unlikely, and I would say it's not government the alternative. That is American language discrediting democracy. It is democracy which is the alternative. It's not government. So I would say, democracy has to take charge, and what democracy decides doesn't need necessarily to be that the government does this or that, but it's important that we go through the democratic process rather than, and in an innovative way, rather than we leave innovation only to the market, and then there is, unfortunately, the profit incentive. And if we talk about, let's change incentive, I wish you good luck if you don't then talk about the incentives of capitalism. Then you have to answer that question, and that's not so easy.
I was just going to say we almost made it through the panel without saying late-stage capitalism. Yes,
sure.
Exactly.
Thank you.
I do, just really briefly, thank you for your very important comment. I hope that my rant didn't make it seem like, I didn't mean to dismiss blockchain. I think it's fascinating, and what the technology could potentially solve around trust, around privacy. There's a lot of really exciting potential. But I think technology and law and policy have to work in tandem because one cannot save the other. So I think that was more of my message. And to find points of entry into a more sort of inviting and inclusive way for more people to help to build and to shape that space, would love to talk. And then in terms of the regulation, I would say in terms of success and all of this regulation, it's great to see more innovation on regulation, and it's good to see the Commission thinking about, the DMA and these sort of novel interventions. I think in terms of success, it all depends on your timeline. So if you think in terms of long term, even the GDPR, we haven't really seen the impact of it, right? We still haven't seen the 4% fine, which EDPB, if they're in here, at some point we should hopefully see a major fine, but I think it takes time for these things to actually come into place and to move from compliance to actual enforcement. So if your timeline is longer, then you can be more optimistic.
Just before you go, Michael, on that last bit, that's also in the report. This report covers a lot of ground, but hopefully it does it quite well. Sorry, Michael.
I have two tiny points. Just one of them is that things like smartphones and computers have been heavily subsidized and cross-subsidized. So we sort of assume that the state sort of withdrew funding that they would provide for roads or electricity or something like that. And I'm not saying the state should fund all computers, but I think we've had it cheaply. And we've had it cheaply for a reason, and that gap needs a political will to change, and that's really, really tricky. But solving that is a big problem. To Eike's point about collectors, as far as I understood it, a big part here is platforms, intermediaries construct collectives, deconstruct them, stop people from seeing each other, encourage certain kinds of organization, and that's why it's so important to tackle those deep platform logics. Because if you don't tackle those logics, you can't actually construct a collective that is designed to challenge those kinds of power, because the actual land you're building on is controlled by the people who you're trying to control the power of.
Yeah, which brings us to the point on reclaiming the interface, reclaiming the algorithm. So that's the answer. Anyway, just on one more sentence on the DMA, DSA, how far that's going. If I have to summarize it with one sentence, I would say this is opening for more market. It's not challenging the business model. So there are in my opinion, no legislative solutions that would challenge the current business model based on exploiting data and controlling the stack. This is not happening in the law. But indeed, there are many more openings possible with the new law for more market. Yeah, so we kind of got stuck in the middle of that transformation.
We've been an hour and a half now. I think that's a lot for this panel. If you'd all join me in thanking the panel and Ada Lovelace Institute. Thank you very much.